The Ashworth Ballroom was a monument to excess, a cathedral of waxed marble and gilded mirrors that multiplied the flames of 1,000 candles. Lady Eleanor Gray moved through it like a ghost, present but unseen, her gown of silver blue silk a hand-me-down from a richer season. The fabric had been turned and pressed so many times that the seams held memory, not shape. She kept her shoulders straight, her chin level, her smile measured exactly to the width of politeness. Inside the long sleeves of her gloves, her wrists ached. She had learned, in 3 London seasons, the precise angle to hold a champagne glass so the liquid did not tremble. She had learned to stand with her back to the wall so no one could approach from behind. She had learned that a woman without a fortune is invisible until she becomes a target, and she had learned that the two states often arrived at the same moment. Across the room, the Duke of Ashworth watched her. Alexander Blackwood, 6th Duke of Ashworth, was not a man given to idle observation. At 29, he controlled one of the largest fortunes in England, sat in the House of Lords, and had refined the art of the glacial stare. He was not cruel, he was simply bored. The debutantes of the ton had long since blurred into a single nervous face. Their mothers saw him as a prize stallion. Their fathers saw him as a ledger. He saw himself as a man holding a door against a rising tide of mediocrity. And then he saw Lady Eleanor Gray. She was not the most beautiful woman in the room. Her hair was too dark for fashion, her eyes too direct for flirtation, her figure too slender to be called alluring. But there was something in the way she held herself, a composure that was not ease but endurance. She did not simper or flutter. She did not track him with her eyes like the others. She seemed, in fact, to be actively avoiding his gaze. That was interesting. The Viscount Hartley was not interesting. He was drunk, red-faced, and weaving through the crowd with the singular purpose of a man who believed himself charming. Eleanor saw him approach and felt her stomach tighten. Hartley had cornered her twice before, once at Almack's, once at a musicale, and each time he had leaned too close, breathed wine on her cheek, and made promises his title could not keep. She had refused him, politely, then firmly, then with a cold finality that should have ended the matter. It had not. Lady Eleanor, Hartley drawled, bowing so low he nearly overbalanced. You have been hiding from me. I have been standing in plain sight, my lord, she said. The distinction is yours to make. His smile slipped, then returned. He reached for her hand, not to shake but to claim. His fingers closed around her wrist, over a bruise that was still healing beneath her glove. The pressure sent a bolt of pain up her arm. Eleanor did not cry out. She did not pull away. She simply turned her head and looked at him, and for a moment the Viscount saw something in her eyes that made his grip loosen. It was not fear. It was something older and far more tired. The Duke of Ashworth was watching. He saw the Viscount seize her wrist. He saw the almost imperceptible flinch, the way her other hand clenched at her side, the way her spine went rigid for a fraction of a second before she forced it to relax. He saw the mark of a woman who had been hurt before and who had learned to disguise it. Their eyes met across the ballroom. Eleanor looked away first, not because she was afraid, but because she had spent 23 years learning that powerful men did not help her. They either hurt her, ignored her, or, worst of all, decided she owed them something for their attention. Alexander Blackwood was not used to being looked away from. It should have annoyed him. Instead, it rooted him to the spot. He watched as Eleanor extracted her wrist from Hartley's grip with a single, fluid motion that made the Viscount look like a clumsy schoolboy. He watched as she curtsied, turned, and walked toward the terrace doors with the unhurried grace of a woman who had decided she needed air more than she needed propriety. He followed. The terrace was cold. Eleanor stood at the stone balustrade, her gloved hands resting lightly on the edge, her breath misting in the November air. She did not turn when the French doors opened behind her. She knew the sound of footsteps. She had learned to read them. You should not be out here alone, the Duke said. No, she agreed, and yet here I am, alone. The scandal is underwhelming. He moved to stand beside her, keeping a careful distance. The Viscount Hartley is not a man to be provoked. I did not provoke him. I existed near him. The distinction matters. Alexander studied her profile. Up close, he could see the faint shadow beneath her eyes, the too sharp angle of her collarbone. She was thinner than she should be, poorer than she appeared. And yet her voice was steady, her posture perfect, her gaze fixed on the darkened garden below with an intensity that suggested she was memorizing the shadows. "You are Lord Rainsford's daughter," he said. "I am his property," she corrected, her tone so flat it took him a moment to register the word. "But yes, the tongue prefers daughter. It sounds less like what it is." Alexander felt something shift in his chest, an unfamiliar sensation, half anger, half alarm. He opened his mouth to respond, but Elinor turned to face him, and the question died on his lips. In the moonlight, her expression was unreadable, composed, almost serene. "I thank you for your concern, Your Grace," she said. "It is unnecessary. I have managed the Viscount Hartley for 2 seasons. I will manage him for a 3rd. And after that—" She smiled, a small, sad curve that did not touch her eyes. "After that I will manage whatever comes next. It is what I do." She curtsied, this time with perfect grace, and walked back into the ballroom before he could respond. Alexander remained on the terrace for a long time, staring at the empty doorway, listening to the distant strains of a waltz. He thought about the mark on her wrist, the careful way she had pulled away, the words she had spoken as if they were ordinary. "I am his property." He had heard many things in his life. Debutantes confessing their love, fathers offering their daughters, mothers scheming for advantages. He had never heard a woman describe herself with such quiet, devastating precision. By the time he returned to the ballroom, Lady Elinor Grey was gone. But she had left something behind, a single glove, white silk, slightly worn at the fingertips. It had fallen on the terrace stones, overlooked in her departure. The Duke picked it up. The fabric was cold. Inside, he could see the faint outline of a hand pressed into the silk from months of use. He folded the glove carefully and placed it in his breast pocket. The waltz ended. The applause began. And somewhere in London, a carriage carried Elinor Grey back to a house where the candles were too low, the servants too few, and a man waited in his study with a ledger of debts and a tongue sharpened by gin. The door closed behind her. The night swallowed the sound. Part 2. The Silent Question. 3 days passed before the Duke of Ashworth sent the letter. It was written in his own hand, a rare thing, for he employed 3 secretaries and sealed with black wax. It requested the pleasure of Lady Elinor Grey's company at Ashworth House to discuss a matter of mutual interest concerning the Rainsford estate. The wording was deliberately vague. The invitation was not. Elinor read it twice, then burned it in the grate of her bedroom fireplace, watching the paper curl and blacken until it was nothing but ash. A discussion of the Rainsford estate. Her father would see it as an opportunity. The Duke would see it as, what? A chance to complete his observation, a game? She did not know. She did not trust it. But she went. Ashworth House was a palace of cold stone and colder silences. The footman who opened the door wore livery so pristine it looked painted on. The butler led her through a hall of portraits, generations of Blackwoods staring down with identical expressions of aristocratic certainty, and into a library that smelled of leather and old fire. The Duke rose from his chair as she entered. He was dressed more casually than she had ever seen him, in a dark coat and riding boots, his cravat loosened at the throat. It should have made him seem approachable. It did not. He looked like a predator momentarily at rest. "Lady Elinor," he said, "you came." "You invited me," she replied. "I assumed you wished to discuss something of importance." "I do, please sit." She sat. He remained standing, moving to the window where pale November light struggled through the glass. For a long moment he said nothing. Elinor folded her hands in her lap. the right wrist aching beneath the pressure of her left thumb. "I have made inquiries," Alexander said finally, still facing the window. "About your father, about his debts, about the Viscount Hartley." Eleanor's heart stuttered, but her voice remained steady. "You have been busy, Your Grace. I was not aware my family was of such interest to you." He turned. His eyes were dark, unreadable. "Your father owes money to men who do not accept apologies. He owes money to Hartley. He owes money to me." The words hung in the air like smoke. Eleanor felt her stomach drop, but she did not look away. "I am aware of my father's debts. I am not aware of how they concern you." "They concern me because you concern me." The confession was so blunt, so unexpected, that for a moment Eleanor forgot to breathe. Then she remembered herself and laughed, a brittle, humorless sound. "Your Grace, you have spoken to me once, at a ball, on a terrace. I assure you I am not worth your concern." "That is precisely what concerns me," he said, "that you believe that." He crossed the room, not stopping until he stood directly before her. Eleanor forced herself to remain seated, to keep her head high, to meet his gaze without flinching. Up close, she could see the faint lines around his eyes, the shadow of stubble on his jaw, the intensity of a man who was not accustomed to being questioned. "You flinched," he said quietly. "When Hartley touched you, you flinched and then you covered it. How long has he been hurting you?" "The Viscount has never touched me beyond what you witnessed." "I did not ask about the Viscount." The silence that followed was absolute. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face, then return in a rush of heat. Her hands, so carefully trained to stillness, began to tremble. She pressed them together hard until the pain steadied her. "I have no idea what you are implying," she said. "No, you do." Alexander's voice dropped lower, softening into something that was not gentleness but its raw material. "Your sleeve, Lady Eleanor. At the ball, when you turned, your sleeve slipped. I saw the bruise, the shape of a hand. Someone has been holding you too tightly. Someone with fingers long enough to wrap around your entire wrist." Eleanor stood. The movement was so abrupt that her chair scraped against the floor. She stepped back away from him, her composure cracking for the first time. "Who did this to you?" The question was soft, dangerously soft. It carried no heat, no threat, only a terrible, patient stillness like a blade held perfectly level. Eleanor stared at him, her chest rising and falling with breaths she could not control. "You have no right," she whispered, "no right to ask me that." "I am asking anyway." "Why? So you can add my humiliation to your collection. So you can tell yourself you are a better man than the others because you offered to save the poor, broken daughter of a gambling earl." Her voice rose, cracking on the last word. "I have seen what your saving looks like, Your Grace. I have seen what men like you do to women like me. You do not save us. You own us. You own us with your money and your titles and your beautiful houses, and you call it protection, and then you wonder why we flinch when you come too close." She stopped, breathing hard, her eyes bright with unshed tears. For a long moment, Alexander said nothing. He simply looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then slowly, he reached into his waistcoat pocket and withdrew something white, her glove, the one she had left on the terrace. "You dropped this," he said. "I kept it, not as a trophy, as a reminder that I saw something that night and I did nothing. I walked away. I let you walk away." He held out the glove. "I am not walking away now." Eleanor stared at the glove, then at him. The tears had not fallen. They would not fall. She had learned that trick long ago. "A cage is still a cage, Your Grace," she said, "even when the door is gilded." She took the glove, turned, and walked out of the library without another word. Alexander stood alone in the silence, listening to her footsteps fade down the marble hall. Then he walked to his desk, sat down, and began to write. The first letter was to his man of business. The second was to a magistrate he trusted. The third was short, addressed to the Earl of Rainsford, and contained exactly one sentence. "If you touch your daughter again, I will know." He sealed it with black wax. Part 3. The Weight of Knowledge. The garden party at Lady Haversham's was a carefully orchestrated exercise in pastoral charm. Guests wandered among clipped hedges and ornamental ponds, sipping lemonade that had been chilled in an ice house and gossiping behind painted fans. Alina wore a gown of pale green muslin that she had altered herself the night before, the stitches hidden beneath a sash of darker ribbon. She had not slept. She had not eaten, but she had learned to function on willpower alone. The letter from the Duke had arrived that morning. Her father had read it at breakfast, his face turning the color of old parchment, then folded it into quarters and tucked it into his pocket without a word. He had left the table, left the house, and not returned. Alina had burned the envelope. Now she stood at the edge of the party, a glass of lemonade warming in her hand, watching the Tun perform its endless ballet. A cluster of debutantes laughed too loudly near the fountain. A dowager whispered behind her fan. A footman moved through the crowd with a tray of stale sandwiches, his face as blank as a playing card. Viscount Hartley found her within minutes. "Lady Alina," he said, his smile broad and damp. "I see the Duke has not yet claimed you for the afternoon. How fortunate for me." "The Duke does not claim me, my lord," Alina said coolly. "I am not a piece of property to be claimed." "Aren't you? I thought that was precisely what a woman of your situation was." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Your father owes me £800. Do you know what happens to men who do not pay their debts? They become viscounts." Hartley's smile vanished. For a moment, something ugly flickered behind his eyes, the same something Alina had seen in her father's face 100 times. Then it was gone, replaced by a thin veneer of courtesy. "You have a sharp tongue," he said. "It will not serve you well when you have nowhere left to go." "I have always had nowhere left to go. It has not stopped me yet." He reached for her arm, the same wrist, the same bruise that had only just begun to fade. But before his fingers could close, a voice cut through the chatter like a blade. "Hartley!" The Viscount froze. Alina turned. The Duke of Ashworth was approaching across the lawn, his stride unhurried, his expression calm. He was dressed for the country, but he carried himself like a man entering a battlefield. The crowd parted around him without consciously deciding to do so. "Your Grace," Hartley said, releasing Alina's arm, "we were just discussing." "I heard what you were discussing. I believe Lady Alina made her position clear." Alexander came to a stop beside Alina, not touching her but close enough that his presence was a wall. "You will not trouble her again." "I was not troubling her. I was extending my condolences on her father's unfortunate situation." "Her father's situation is not her concern," Alexander said. "It is mine." The words fell like stones into still water. Alina felt the eyes of the Tun upon her, dozens of eyes, sharp with curiosity, bright with scandal. She kept her face composed, but inside something was fracturing, not from fear, from anger. The Duke was doing exactly what she had predicted. He was saving her, publicly, which meant she would owe him, which meant the cage was closing. "The Duke is very generous with his concern," she said, her voice carrying just far enough to be overheard. "But I am not a charity. I am not a debt to be collected, and I am not in need of rescue." She curtsied to Alexander, then to Hartley, then turned and walked away from both of them, her spine straight, her heart pounding. She made it to the edge of the garden before her composure cracked. She found a stone bench hidden behind a trellis of climbing roses and sat down, pressing her hands to her face. She did not cry. She had not cried in years. But she sat very still, breathing in the scent of earth and green leaves, and waited for the shaking to stop. It did not stop. The sun moved behind a cloud. The garden grew cooler. And Alina Gray, daughter of the Earl of Rainsford, sat alone with the knowledge that she had just publicly refused the most powerful man in England, and that she would pay for it. She did not know it yet, but across the garden the Duke of Ashworth was watching her through a gap in the trellis. He had followed her, not to confront her, not to demand an explanation, simply to be sure she was safe. When he saw her sitting alone, her hands over her face, her shoulders rigid with suppressed emotion, he felt something break inside his chest. It was a small break, like a crack in ice, but it spread. He turned away. That night he wrote to the Earl of Rainsford. The letter was not kind. It itemized every gambling debt, every outstanding obligation, every whispered rumor about the Earl's treatment of his daughter. It ended with a single sentence that was not a threat, but a promise. "I am coming for everything you have, and I will not stop until she is free of you." He signed it with his full name and title. Then he sent a second letter, this one to a woman he had not thought of in years. A woman who lived in Scotland, far from the Tun, far from London, far from everything he knew. He wrote, "I need your help." Part 4. The Court of Whispers. The scandal broke on a Tuesday. A letter purportedly written by Eleanor to Viscount Hartley had been found in the pocket of a coat at a gaming hell. It was not a love letter. It was worse. It was a letter that suggested an arrangement, money in exchange for influence, Eleanor's influence over her father's remaining connections, an understanding that would benefit both parties. The language was crude, explicit, and entirely fabricated. Eleanor read it in the newspaper, sitting at her bedroom window while the November rain lashed against the glass. She did not gasp. She did not throw the paper. She read it twice, carefully, then folded it into a neat square and placed it on her dressing table. Her father had left for the coast the night before. The servants had been dismissed. The house was empty. The Tun erupted. Within hours, every drawing room in London was humming with the news. Lady Eleanor Grey, so quiet, so composed, so evidently above reproach, exposed as a schemer, a fortune hunter, a woman of loose morals and looser penmanship. The fact that the letter was obviously forged did not matter. The Tun did not care about truth. It cared about entertainment. Eleanor received 3 invitations that morning. All were rescinded by afternoon. She spent the day in her room packing. Not for Scotland. That plan was still months away, contingent on a position she had not yet secured. She packed for the only destination available to a woman in disgrace: silence. She would return to the family's country estate, a damp and crumbling house in Dorset, and wait for the storm to pass. The Duke of Ashworth did not wait. By noon he had summoned his solicitor. By 2 he had purchased the vowels, the debt notes, that the Earl had signed to Hartley and a dozen other creditors. By 4 he had secured the services of the best handwriting expert in London. By 6 he had identified the forger, a disgraced clerk who had once worked for Hartley's estate, paid to produce the letter in a moment of vindictive spite. By 8 he was at the opera. The opera was the event of the season, a new production of Don Giovanni, attended by every person of consequence in London. Eleanor had not planned to attend. She had no invitation, but she had one dress that was not yet packed, a dark blue silk that had belonged to her mother, and a desperate, defiant need to be seen before she disappeared. She arrived alone, which was itself a scandal. She walked through the lobby with her head high, ignoring the whispers that followed her like a wake. She found a place in the back of the stalls, standing room only, where the light was too dim for anyone to see her face clearly. The opera began. The music swelled. And then, during the first interval, the Duke of Ashworth stood up from his private box, descended the grand staircase, and walked directly to where Eleanor stood. He did not speak. He simply offered her his arm. The entire opera house watched. Eleanor looked at his arm, then at his face. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were dark with something she could not name. For a long moment she did not move. Then slowly she placed her gloved hand on his sleeve. He led her up the staircase, past the staring faces, past the silent mouths, past the dowagers and the debutantes and the men who had looked away. He led her into his private box, where a chair waited beside his own. "You should not have come," she said quietly, once the curtain had risen again and the music had resumed. "You should not have had to come alone," he replied. "They will say you have ruined yourself." "Let them, I have been ruined before." Alina turned to look at him. In the dim light of the box, his face was half in shadow, half illuminated by the glow of the stage. He was watching her, not the opera, and there was something in his gaze that made her feel, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that she was not invisible. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "Because someone should have done it sooner." "That is not an answer." He was silent for a long moment. Then very quietly he said, "Because I cannot stop. Because since the moment I saw you on that terrace I have not been able to think of anything else. Because you are the first person in years who has looked at me and seen something other than a title and a fortune. Because," he stopped, his jaw tightening, "because you deserve to be protected and I have failed to protect you." Alina felt the words settle over her like a weight. They were honest, painfully honest. And yet they were also the words of a man who still believed protection was something he could give, rather than something she could choose. "I do not want your protection," she said softly. "I want your respect." The aria on stage reached its climax. The audience held its breath. "You have it," the Duke said. "You have had it since the moment you refused to flinch." Alina did not answer. She turned back to the stage, her hand still resting on his sleeve, and let the music wash over her. But in the darkness of the box, her fingers tightened just slightly on the fabric of his coat. It was not forgiveness, not yet. But it was a beginning. Part 5: The Duke's Reckoning. The Earl returned to London 3 days later, and the reckoning began. It came not as a confrontation but as a quiet unraveling. The Earl arrived at his empty townhouse to find a letter from his solicitor, informing him that his debts had been called in. All of them. Every creditor, every vowel, every obligation, purchased by a single buyer who now held the Earl's financial future in his hands. The buyer was the Duke of Ashworth. The Earl raged. He drank. He sent a letter to the Duke demanding an explanation, threatening legal action. The Duke did not reply. He sent a second letter, this one to Alina, ordering her to return home immediately and behave with the dignity expected of a daughter of this house. Alina read the letter in the small sitting room of a friend's townhouse, a friend who had taken her in despite the scandal, despite the risk, because she too had once been a woman alone in London. She read it twice, then folded it and placed it in the fire. She did not return home. The next morning the Earl appeared at the door. It was early, not yet 9, and the street was wet with the previous night's rain. Alina received him in the narrow entrance hall, standing with her back to the stairs, her hands clasped in front of her. "You will come with me," the Earl said. His voice was low, but his hands were shaking from drink, from rage, from the collapse of everything he had built. "You will come home, and you will marry Hartley, and you will end this madness before it destroys us both." "There is no us, father," Alina said quietly. "There has not been an us for a very long time." "Do not be foolish. I am your father. I have the right to determine your future." "You have the right of law," she agreed, "but not the right of love, not the right of respect, not the right of my consent." He struck her. The blow caught her across the face, hard enough to snap her head to the side. She tasted blood. The room spun, but she did not fall. She had learned years ago how to take a blow without falling. The Earl raised his hand again. The door opened. It was not a servant. It was the Duke of Ashworth standing on the threshold, his greatcoat wet with rain, his face like carved stone. He had come early, he would later explain, because he had heard the Earl was in London. Because he had known, with a certainty that made his stomach turn, what would happen when father and daughter met. He saw the mark on Alina's face. He saw the blood at the corner of her mouth. He saw the raised hand, the drunken fury, the cowardice that had ruled this house for 2 decades. And the Duke of Ashworth, the most powerful man in England, crossed the room in 3 strides and seized the Earl by the throat. "If you touch her again," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "I will kill you. I will kill you, and I will use every power I possess to ensure that history remembers you as the monster you are." The Earl clawed at the Duke's hand, his face purpling, his breath a wet rasp. Elinor watched, frozen, her hand pressed to her bleeding mouth. "Alexander," she said. It was the first time she had used his name. The Duke released the Earl, who collapsed against the wall, gasping. He turned to Elinor, and the fury in his face melted into something raw and desperate. He reached for her, then stopped, his hand hovering inches from her cheek. "I am sorry," he said. "I am sorry I did not come sooner." Elinor looked at him, at the rain dripping from his hair, at the blood on her fingers, at the man who had just threatened to kill her father and meant every word. "You came," she said. "That is enough." She fainted. Alexander caught her before she hit the floor, sweeping her into his arms as if she weighed nothing. The Earl was still gasping against the wall, wheezing, his face the color of tallow. Alexander did not look at him. He carried Elinor out of the house, into the rain, and into his waiting carriage. "Ashworth House," he told the driver, "and send for a physician." The carriage pulled away. The Earl was left alone in the hallway, slumped against the wall, his chest heaving, his hands trembling. The front door stood open. The rain blew in. And somewhere above him, in a room that had once been Elinor's, a window banged against its frame. The sound echoed through the empty house. Part 6. The Long Road North. Elinor woke in a bed that was not her own, in a room that smelled of wood smoke and fresh linen, with a fire burning low in the grate. Her face ached. Her mouth tasted of iron. But she was warm and she was safe, and for the first time in years she did not wake in fear. The Duke was sitting in a chair beside the bed. He had not slept. His coat was draped over the arm of the chair, his cravat untied, his boots gone. He was watching her with an expression that was part exhaustion, part relief, and part something else, something Elinor was not ready to name. "How long?" she asked. Her voice came out rough, barely a whisper. "Since yesterday morning. You fainted. The physician says you have not been eating. He says you have not been sleeping. He says—" Alexander stopped, his jaw tightening. "He says there are older bruises, bruises that are not from yesterday." Elinor closed her eyes. "You know." "I know." The silence stretched between them, heavy and waiting. Outside, the rain had stopped. A pale winter sun was struggling through the curtains. "I am leaving," Elinor said, "for Scotland. I have a position as a governess. It is not much, but it is far from here." "Scotland?" The word sounded hollow in his mouth. "You would go to Scotland to teach other people's children, while your own father walks free in London." "My father will never walk free. He carries his prison with him. It is made of debt and drink and the knowledge that he has lost everything." She opened her eyes and turned her head to look at him. "You took everything from him, didn't you?" "Not everything," Alexander said quietly. "Not yet." "What do you mean?" He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I have purchased his debts. I have cut off his credit. I have made it impossible for him to borrow another penny from any reputable lender in England. But there is one thing he still possesses, one thing he has never valued, and one thing I want more than anything in the world." "What?" "You," he said. "I want you, Elinor, not to save, not to own. I want you to choose me freely, without debt or obligation or fear. I want you to marry me because you cannot imagine your life without me in it, because I cannot imagine mine without you." Elinor stared at him. The words were so honest, so unguarded, that she felt them like a physical blow. "You said once that a cage is still a cage, even when the door is gilded," Alexander continued. "You were right. I have spent my life building gilded cages, and I did not even know it. I have been so busy being the Duke that I forgot how to be a man. I forgot how to want something without trying to control it. I forgot how to ask instead of demand. He reached for her hand, then stopped, his fingers curling into a fist on the blanket. So I am asking, not as a duke, not as a creditor, as a man who has seen you bleed and who would rather cut off his own hand than see you bleed again. The fire crackled. The wind moved through the chimney. Somewhere in the house, a clock struck the hour. Alina looked at him for a long time. Then she reached beneath the blanket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, a letter, creased and worn, that she had hidden in her dress before she left the townhouse. "This arrived before my father came," she said. "I did not have time to read it." Alexander took the letter. He unfolded it and read. It was from the Earl. It was an apology, not to Alina or to Hartley, a confession of everything, the gambling, the debts, the arrangements he had made. But it was the last paragraph that made Alexander's hands go still. "And if the girl refuses again, you have my permission to do what you must. A broken wrist heals. A ruined reputation does not. Take her if you can, and if you cannot, make sure she is ruined beyond repair." The date on the letter was 3 weeks before the ball, where Hartley had seized her wrist. Alexander looked up. His face was white. His hands were trembling, not with weakness, but with the effort of containing a rage so vast it threatened to swallow him whole. "He gave Hartley permission," he said. His voice was flat dead. "He gave him permission to hurt you." Alina nodded. "I found it in his study a month ago. I have been carrying it ever since. I thought it would protect me. Evidence. Leverage. But all it did was make me realize that I was never his daughter. I was his currency." Alexander stood. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her, his hands braced on the sill. His shoulders were rigid, his breathing controlled. When he finally spoke, his voice was very quiet. "Do you trust me?" Alina considered the question, not as a woman answering a suitor, but as a woman who had spent her entire life learning that trust was a weapon to be used against her. "I am learning," she said. He turned. His eyes were wet. The most powerful man in England, and there were tears on his face. "Then let me finish this," he said. "Let me end it." Alina looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached out her hand. This time he took it. Part 7. BY Morning THEY feared HIM. The Duke of Ashworth moved with the precision of a man who had spent his life navigating the corridors of power. He did not rush. He did not rage. He simply set the machinery of his influence into motion, and by the time the sun set on London, 3 things had happened. The first was a visit to the offices of the Morning Chronicle, where a senior editor received a dossier containing the forged letter, the handwriting expert's testimony, and a sworn statement from the clerk who had been paid to produce it. The story appeared in the next morning's edition, under the headline, "Viscount Hartley accused of fraud and conspiracy." The second was a private meeting with the Lord Chancellor, during which the Earl of Rainsford's letter to Hartley was presented, not as evidence of a daughter's suffering, but as proof of a conspiracy to commit assault. The Lord Chancellor, a man with 3 daughters of his own, read the letter in silence. When he finished, he looked up. "What do you want, Ashworth?" "I want him stripped of every protection his title provides. I want him arrested publicly, and I want the Viscount charged as an accomplice." "And the daughter?" "She will be out of his reach before the morning papers are on the streets." The Lord Chancellor nodded slowly. "It will be done." The third thing was a message sent to the Earl of Rainsford, delivered by a rider who did not dismount. It read, "Sign over all legal rights to your daughter, and you will not face the courts. Refuse, and I will ensure you face far worse than debtor's prison." The Earl signed. At dawn, Alexander returned to Ashworth House. He found Alina in the library, dressed in a borrowed gown, standing at the window where he had first asked her to sit. She turned when he entered, and he saw that the bruise on her face had begun to fade, though it would be days before it disappeared entirely. "It is done," he said. "Hartley is arrested. Your father has signed away his rights. You are free." Alina stared at him. "Free," she repeated. The word sounded foreign on her tongue, as if she were testing the shape of it. "There is a position in Scotland," Alexander said carefully. "A governess for a family near Edinburgh. It is yours if you want it. No one will stop you. No one will follow you." He paused, his voice dropping. "But I will wait. If you ever decide that you want more than freedom, if you ever decide that you want me, I will be here." Alina crossed the room to him. She moved slowly, deliberately, as if each step required a decision. When she reached him, she took his face in her hands and looked into his eyes. "You would let me go," she said. "You would really let me go." "I would," he said, "because I love you, and love is not a cage. I understand that now." Alina smiled. It was a small smile, tentative, but it reached her eyes. "I am not going to Scotland," she said. "I am going to stay here with you, if you will have me." The words hung between them, bright and terrifying. Alexander's hands rose to cover hers, his fingers gentle against the fatting bruises. "I will have you," he said, "in any way you will allow, for any reason you choose, for the rest of my life if you will let me." Alina kissed him. It was not a kiss of passion or desperation. It was a kiss of choice, deliberate, quiet, and certain. When she pulled back, Alexander was smiling, and there were tears on his face again, but this time they were not tears of rage. "By morning, every cruel man in the county will know what I have done," he said. "They will know that the Duke of Ashworth does not forget, that he does not forgive, that he will ruin anyone who harms the people he loves." "Let them know," Alina said. "I am not afraid anymore." The announcement appeared in the Gazette 3 days later. The Ton, which had whispered and speculated and sharpened its claws, fell silent in shock. The Duke of Ashworth was to marry Lady Alina Grey, the daughter of a disgraced earl, the woman who had been ruined and restored in the space of a single season. But the gossips did not have the full story. They did not know about the bruises, the letters, the quiet moments in a library where a woman had taught a man that power was not protection, and protection was not love. They did not know that the Duke of Ashworth had spent the night before his wedding sitting alone in his study, reading a single letter over and over again. It was from Alina, and it was short. "Alexander," it said, "I used to believe that love was a cage with gilded bars. I was wrong. Love is a door, and you have opened it for me. I am walking through it now. Will you walk with me?" He wrote his reply at dawn, and he did not send it. He carried it with him to the church, and when the ceremony was over, when the vows were spoken and the ring was on her finger and the world outside was still waking, he pressed it into her hand. Alina read it in the carriage, as London faded behind them and the road to Scotland stretched before them, not as an escape, but as a beginning. Yes, the letter said, always, every door, every day, forever. She folded the letter and placed it in her pocket, next to the glove he had kept all those weeks ago. Then she leaned against her husband's shoulder and closed her eyes. The carriage rolled north. The sun rose behind them, bright and unafraid. And by morning, every cruel man in the county feared the Duke of Ashworth. But the woman beside him feared nothing at all.